This week, we're back to looking at the Gospel of Mark again, which is our primary gospel that we're going through this year. And we're talking about the calling of the first disciples. Now, the stories of John last week, we heard about Nathaniel and Bartholomew. Those names aren't in Matthew's, Mark's, or Luke's Gospels. So we're not really sure where those are. In fact, I counted one time and there's 15, 12 disciples. So the traditional names that we know are in the three synoptic gospels. This is Mark's version, which is shorter, more precise, more concise than anything that Matthew or Luke did, because those gospels are much more verbose, much more have a lot more detail. Mark doesn't waste time on detail. It's just kind of go, go, go. Let's get this story out. Let's be part of what's going on. So we have at the beginning of this passage a mention of John the Baptist. He's gone now. Had a horrible experience, and that meant Jesus now came out. He'd had the temptation in the desert, and now he's coming out to start his ministry. And the very first thing we hear about that ministry is that he's preaching. Far too often when we're looking at the call of the disciples, we jump ahead to where Simon and Andrew and James and John are at their fishing boats. And Jesus says, come along. And they do. And it's really strange. What's going on? Why is Jesus such an attractive being that these people would just automatically walk away? Well, it wasn't just that. He had already been preaching in the area. These men probably had at least heard of, if not were there to listen to what Jesus was telling them. And you have to remember that in the first century, the concept that everybody was of equal value to God, mind-blowing. That was just not part of the world that they shared. So here was this itinerant preacher walking around, and he wasn't alone. There's a lot of people who did this, walking around telling them that God loves them, that they matter, that they are just as important as whatever king or emperor is on the throne. That is a radical, radical message of inclusion, because society would be telling these people that they're just barely worth dirt. So it would be a very attractive message. And he was sharing this. And in the nature of the day, when these teachers went around, and as I said, there's quite a few, they would then have schools around them. People gathered around them. So the word disciple is not something that is unique to Jesus and his followers. All these other traveling teachers would have their own disciples around them, and they would be the ones who study, who ask questions, who move forward. Now, one of the differences is that the disciples of other teachers, whether they're Stoic teachers or Platonists or whatever philosophy is going on, the students had to pay the teacher, because that's how the teacher survived. With Jesus followers, we know through history, we know through references in the scriptures, that the ministry of Jesus was provided by, or is financially supported a lot by the women. Mary Magdalene, one of her big contributions as a wealthy woman was to make sure that Jesus' ministry was supported. So these fisherfolk, who would never have been able to follow another teacher because they wouldn't have had the money to do it, are suddenly now able to follow someone who is changing their world, changing their perspective. And they want to get out and they want to go do it. And the story says that Jesus just walks along the shore and he calls to them. They probably recognized him. Like, yeah, that's the guy. We were listening to him. He made such a difference. I really, really like what he has to say. I want to hear more. So they left their jobs. Now, fishing at that point in time, most jobs were actually inherited. The Roman government would have a certain number of licenses that would go out to fishing families. So the sons would inherit from the fathers, and everybody in the family would be part of that trade. So the daughters and the mothers would be involved with it as well. And the Roman government decided quotas. Now, in Jerusalem area, they probably, because they still technically had a king, the Romans would use the puppet king to make some of these decisions. But in Galilee, they were not under the king. They were directly under Rome. So Rome decided how many fish the people were allowed to have access to and how much had to go to the Roman crown to be sold overseas or to be eaten in Rome or whatever was going to happen to it. So these were lives that were really, really constricted. So they walked away from them. And we're led to believe, or at least tradition has led us to believe, that they walked away for 3 years and never came back. That's not how it actually went. There's been enough work done on this area that during downtime, because you can't fish all year long, during downtime they would go with Jesus. And when it was important for the fishing to happen, where the family to happen, they would go back. You know, Galilee isn't like Canada where we're just huge and vast and we can't even get together regularly. Galilee was really small, and people could move around and they could do what they needed to do and still manage to make it home. And one of the things that I absolutely adore about this is that the wives had to give permission. The men could not leave home for more than 3 weeks without their wives' permission. It kind of lends credence to how much the family was the center of the Hebrew tradition and how much women actually had authority in that culture. We kind of tend to assume they were all like ancient Greece where women were locked up and didn't have any voice, but that wasn't the case at all. Certainly not when Jesus was around. So we have these fisher folk who have inherited this license. They are working with their fathers, as John and James were. They're working with their father Zebedee. And they see this preacher, this teacher that has just absolutely amazed them coming along the shore. And they look up and they recognize him. And Jesus says, "Come, follow me. Come along," and they do. And that is the metaphor. That's the start of the imaging of what we call in the Christian faith the calling. In Latin, it's voca something or other. So the word vocation comes out of this as well, which is a little more nuanced than calling. Vocation suggests a certain action or employment that goes along with something you are passionate about doing, like teaching or preaching or being a lawyer. Jobs that are hard unless you actually feel that you're called, that you have a passion to do that kind of thing. These are the callings that the early church recognized in the disciples, that they were so passionate, something in them was moved so much that they needed to get up and be part of it. And they wanted to know more about it. And they wanted to share it with other people. That was what they were called to do. And again, we're talking about poorly educated poor folk who are suddenly leaders in a ragtag band of folks that are just all walks of life, all abilities, all colors, all shapes and sizes. And they're leaders in that. They would never have been leaders anywhere else, but Jesus gave them that gift of leadership. So the calling was there. And we talk about calling in our modern world, and we're not always sure what to do with that. In the church, we talk about it a lot, especially evolved with people who are going for ministry. We talk about having the call to ministry, call to being a preacher. And the call can be an incredible experience. It can be just a knowing in your heart that something is right. It can be a routine attraction to a certain lifestyle or a certain discipline or a certain type of employment that just kind of keeps coming back and coming back and coming back. Or another way, and this is what happened to me, I was sitting in class one day and I heard a voice, kind of right back here. I heard a voice. And it wasn't something I heard with my ears. I heard it with my heart, and I heard it with my soul. And the only word that came through was translate. And that, the meaning around that I got very, very clearly, is to take the stuff that the academy, that all the academics have been working on, and make that accessible to people who will never spend the 12 years that I have in university, but they want to know anyway. So my calling is kind of to stand between everybody else and the academic world and kind of be that bridge. And that's where I shine. That's where I do my best work. That's what this entire website is about, is making that bridge for people. It's a calling. There are people who are called for all sorts of reasons, and all of them end up being spiritual causes. I was talking with a friend of mine not long ago, and I said, offhand, I said, people who connect don't connect through theology. We connect through spirituality. She thought it was really great. I thought it was cool. I'm passing it on. But we do not connect, and we do not grow, and we do not sense our calling just because someone made a good argument. When Jesus was talking to the disciples, he wasn't making a good argument. He was telling them that they had value, that they mattered, that they were people that God was paying attention to. There was no hard sale, there was no convincing, there was no argument of right or wrong. It's just all about love and how we can show self love and communal love. That was the messaging that attracted the disciples. Our callings today are very similar. When you are called to work with children, you have a certain sense of love for that population. When you're called to work with seniors, same thing. You have a sense of love for that population. And that sense of love helps you through the hard times. That's where the calling really comes in. It's not during the pleasant days, because anybody can do anything when it's pleasant. The calling comes in for the hard times. And Jesus understood that, because we can never read a gospel, never read any of the stories of Jesus without remembering how it ends. And we bring that back into the beginning again. There will be a time, of course, when Jesus is not with these people. But right now he is. There will be a time when these folks are left to teach on their own. But that's not now. We know that the hard times are going to come for them. But right now, they're just starting to learn. They're just starting to be filled with the Spirit and starting to understand a lot more about their relationship with God and about how Jesus wants them to live. And it starts with being called. It's an experience that any of us could have in our faith. It doesn't mean that we have to get up and march through the desert or travel someplace else. Now, that can happen for some folks. But we can be called right here where we are, a social cause that really touches our heart. That's a calling. Helping out people that really matter or need your help, and you recognize that and you want to be there. That's a calling. Jobs that need to get done that are not really particularly enjoyable. That's a calling. This is how Jesus calls us, to do the big things and the little things, because they all matter equally to God. We are like the disciples. We are hearing this calling for the first time. So the question is, are we going to get up and follow?